Hello everyone and welcome. I hope you guys are all doing well. Today guys, we're back with some updates regarding the Total War Warhammer World Championship. Currently the prize pool is $3,356 and the event is going to be starting relatively soon. So stay tuned for updates here on the channel, videos, replays, all that sort of good stuff. Now on that subject, there is a lot of people in the event. Of course today I'm joined by Aerocrastic. And how many folks do we have signed up for the event so far?
Well, right now we've got 703 people registered.
Jeez,
so this
yeah, it's
is
huge.
the biggest multiplayer event in the history of Total War to date.
I mean, I think before that, what was even close? Like, was there any single event that had registration anywhere near that? I don't think so.
Not even close. The biggest we've seen in the past, I think, was in the neighborhood of 200 to 300. So we literally just doubled that and went over it.
Yeah, it's going to be huge for sure. And on that note, obviously, there's probably a lot of new players coming into the event who may not be terribly familiar with the banner rules, which of course are the community rules, which you've authored here, that we usually adhere to in the ECLs and many other leagues that you've seen on YouTube and Twitch. So in this video today, we're going to go through the banner rules in more of a topical sense. Just look at the basics, and Arrow will walk you through all of those bad boys, and hopefully that'll be a helpful tool for you guys to get into the tournament and know what's going on. So on that note, we can begin with the very basics. We'll start with the minimum army size page. So you want to walk us through that, and what is the minimum army count? What are the different limits on infantry, monsters, all that sort of good stuff.
Yeah, so as far as minimum army size is concerned, we're looking at a 300 model count. So it can consist of any number of unit cards. It just has to have at least 300 entities in the army, and this is of course to kind of tie a little bit of a noose around some of those slightly less savory, very monster heavy builds.
Yeah, no. Warhammer 1, man, I remember the days, the dark ages of armies with like 150 units. It's just like a bunch of skirmish cav and single entities, and it was just awful. And yeah, this is definitely really good.
Yeah.
And 300 is pretty attainable for sure. Even if you want to have a box with like some iron breakers, 300 is definitely doable.
Yeah, 300 is like just barely enough to allow full kite and like box strategies. So for the most part, it doesn't really. I don't think most people even like consider the model count, unless they're really going heavy into single entities, and that is essentially like, what it is that this rule is meant to hit on. So that's.
And it changed recently, wasn't it? Like, was it 250 or was it 350 at one point? I know there was some sort of a change in the past year or so, right?
Yeah, so the banner rules borrows a lot of ideas from Shetland Apache and Pippington's
Mm-hmm.
Warhammer Cup rule set. For them, they had the minimum model count at 250 models, and for me, I just bumped that up when we made the transition.
Yeah, it seems doable. Like I was saying, like even the other day, I was playing a full high elf kite build with like a dragon, and having 45 models in those reavers with like a couple spear units usually gets you there. It's really not too bad.
Yeah.
So next we have the unit limits. So this is certain unit type, right? By infantry, by rare single entities. Could you kind of walk us through what that means? How does it kind of vary if like two units, like let's say for example you have Chaos Marauders and then Chaos Marauders with great weapons, do they count as that same towards that 5? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, so as far as units with different weapon variants, I'll get into that a little bit later.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good.
But the starting limits for all of these unit types, and we kind of go down in tighter restrictions depending on how much the meta is propagated by these types of units. So infantry is kind of that very generalist, low offense unit. Whenever people are talking about cheese, rarely ever has anything to do with infantry.
Yeah, never.
So they have that loose maximum 5 of a kind. We get into the mobility. We're starting to get into what really gets the gears of Total War turning, right? That monstrous infantry, your war beasts, cavalry chariots, and then also artillery. These are the kinds of things that, in larger numbers, could potentially swing things a little bit more. So, we're trying to keep things in terms of like relative power level fairly comparable to each other. Like having an army comprised of infantry versus having an army comprised of cavalry won't necessarily inherently net you an advantage per se.
Mm-hmm.
You'll just be building around different things and have different synergies to take advantage of. We get into now the single entities. This is where Total War really
the real problem children of the community here.
Yeah, Warhammer really accentuates this. those single entities, yeah, monsters are cool, but they're also they've always been a hot topic as far as balance is concerned. So these get a maximum three total instead of maximum three of a kind. And that's to make sure that people don't, just dump all their funds into single entities and then just kind of go for armies that snipe your missile units or whatever, and then just sit there in like massive blob of single entities.
Hmm.
Nobody likes that.
And you something also to that we will touch upon a little bit later in the video, but just to kind of get it out there early so you guys can kind of get a perception of this, a rare single entity is different than a basic single entity. So things that do have the asterisk next to it in the army limit sections are considered rare single entities. In total, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're allowed to have 5 single entities. So that could be like Vlad von Karstein, 2 White Kings on foot, or a White King on foot. Then you could have like 2 Vargulfs and a Mortis engine, right?
Mhm. Exactly. So the Vargulfs and the Mortis engine all count as these rare single
Mm-hmm.
entities, and that's where you hit the three total. And then Vlad and a White King are just regular single entities. There are a couple of units that are exempt from this category, like Corpse Carts and Grail Relics.
Hell yeah, dude.
So, you could hypothetically take an army with more single entities if you take those.
What is the limit
Um,
on corpse carts? Actually, just a totally random thought. Is there
it's
is there a limit on them? 6.
it's six.
So you could
Yeah.
have 6 corpse carts in an army.
Yep.
Oh my god, that'd be so funny.
I don't know if anyone's going to do that, but you're definitely welcome to go for it.
That's pretty hilarious.
It's the Hellman Gorst build.
So the hero units and single entities, you guys can see the line that the first subject arrow was talking about was the rare single entities. So those will have the asterisks and the army rules that you guys will see once we get a little bit further in the document. And then on top of that, you can have hero units or single entities. So these are, like we said, these things are considered single entities, but they do not constitute a rare single entity. It's basically like foot characters or characters riding horses or things that essentially aren't big oppressive monsters. Correct?
Yep, that's exactly it.
Got it. Got it. So now
So
we have the units counting towards the same limit. So you want to go into that a bit?
yeah, so this is where things get a little bit more nuanced. So shielded units count towards the same limit as unshielded variants of a unit. This is kind of a wordy text, but basically what it means is that if you look at infantry, which is max 5 of a kind, and then if we go down to the price bracket beneath it, spearmen are within that 0 to 900 price range, so they do not receive any additional limitations. They're max 5 Empire spearmen.
Hmm.
So if I wanted to mix and match spearmen, I could take any combination of up to 5 of either shielded or unshielded spearmen.
Copy that.
Um, that's essentially what this means. So the same thing goes for like wild riders and other things like that. So essentially what it means is that like you can't take 10 spearmen because you take 5 without shields and 5 with shields. It's 5 with or without shields.
Got it.
Um,
Understood. So where that differs though is with different weapon variants. So if we have a sword and board guy versus a guy with a great weapon, correct? In the case of like Chaos Marauders.
Yes. So with the Chaos Marauder example, um, this applies to the weapon variant rule, which is up to 8 of a unit with different weapon variants. So what this means is that you can mix and match Marauders, up to a total of 8 Marauders, but no more than 5 of each type. So you could take 5 regular ones and 3 with great weapons, 4 regular ones and 4 with great weapons, and so on and so forth.
Got it. Got it. And this is something that we see super often in like the Skaven roster because most Skaven players don't actually bring Skaven infantry; they just bring like Skaven slaves, and you usually will see they can only have a total of 8, right? So like between the Skaven slave spears and the Skaven slave sword guys, you can have 8 in
Yep.
total. Yeah.
Yep. That's it.
Understood. And now on to so units with a 360 firing arc. This is one that we see broken, I think, quite often. So in general, units that do have a 360 firing arc are limited to 6, correct?
That is correct. These are your Way Watchers, Way Stalkers, Glade Guards, or sorry, not Glade Guards, Deepwood Scouts.
Yeah.
Most missile cavalry fires in 360 as well.
Hmm.
Most missile chariots fire in 360. All of those. Speaking of chariots, chariots are limited to 4 total. That includes ones with missile attacks. So as you guys can see, there are a lot of limits that kind of overlap with each other. These in particular are consistent with what quick battle limits use. But to have it explicated in text is, uh, just for the sake of having that information there. That's there.
Got it.
Um, and to put a little bit of a limitation on some of those like really mobile shooting builds, cavalry or chariots with missile attacks are limited to 6 total as well. Um, so where this becomes a factor is mostly in Dark Elf play because they uniquely have repeater crossbows which do not fire in 360. Um, so in some cases in the olden days, you would see armies that had like 4 units of repeater crossbows, 2 Scourge Runner chariots, or 2 of those Cold One chariots, and 4 what's it called? 4 Black Ark Corsair handbows, and
Oh my
it's
god.
kind of like that type of put everything on skirmish mode, kind of sit there and laugh kind of an army. So that's why we threw in that limitation.
Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense. That type of stuff can not only be unfun to play against, but also can be a little bit obnoxious for sure.
Mhm.
So the next thing we have here is the unit limit price bracket. So this is what Arrow was referring to before, correct? So you just want to kind of
Yep.
walk people through what this is, and then of course we can go on to the restricted unit list down here and explain why these specific units have those restrictions.
Yep. So for here, the unit limit price bracket might look a little bit confusing at first. Basically, all it means is that if a unit that is infantry or not infantry and not a single entity falls within this price range, then you'll go from where underneath unit limits it says maximum so and so of a kind. You'll deduct a certain amount from that limit. So, for example, we have swordsmen, which is an infantry unit, so they're maximum 5, and they fall within the 0 to 900 price bracket, so therefore they get a -0 tacked on, and therefore the unit is max 5.
Hmm.
Blood Knights are a cavalry unit. Cavalry is maximum 4 of a kind, and their price range is 1700, which is in that 1201 plus range. So their limit is 4 minus 1, meaning 3.
Hmm.
And that's
Got it.
just kind of how this price bracket works out.
Yeah, it's a handy little tool, man. And now we have the restricted unit list. So something you guys have probably seen, right? Watching various tournaments on my channel and other folks' platforms. You've seen things with vampire counts. They'll bring 2 Vargulfs, so you'll see different factions that essentially bring 2 of the same monster, or and it's a little bit looser in regards to the restrictions. Now there are some big monsters that you see listed here that have a special rule that you can only ever bring 1, so you can't bring double Necrofex Colossus or Star Dragon. So what is some of the reasoning behind why these ones are restricted and perhaps something like a Vargulf or a Terrorgeist isn't?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the power level of these units or their utility is very specific and very extreme.
Mhm.
So the thing that we found when allowing people to take multiples of these units is that you get some builds that are, really they'd probably be like a textbook definition of cheese.
Yeah.
Where you just kind of go all in on one strategy, and as you guys can see, they're all single entities, which is kind of a big hint as to what it is that is favored in the game engine and by design. But these are all single entities, and they really create some very nasty synergies. Double Necrofex Colossus is absolutely brutal to factions that have to rely on cavalry or similar units. Double steam tanks can run over quite a bit. Factions like Chaos, for example, that have a kind of an awkward like dissemination of anti-large across their roster can't reasonably build an army that could deal with 2 steam tanks while still dealing with the other range of Empire factions out there. So,
Mhm.
you're kind of by allowing people to take more of these units, you kind of propagate build roulette in its actual sense. Double Star Dragon, yeah, net breath combo, except there's 2 Star Dragons.
Yeah.
Um,
You could just delete anything, basically. Yeah.
Pretty much. You saw Kolick dying a whole lot during those times. Pyro Titan, double Pyro Titan. So why is this one banned? Well, Spirit Leeching and Lord Sniping in general. The Pyro Titan, Spirit Leech, or bound spells in general stack with spells that cost mana. So you can have a Spirit Leech from Arkan and a Spirit Leech from a Pyro Titan going at the same time. Functionally, what this means is that Arcan Spirit Leeches, one of the Hierotitan Spirit Leeches. When Arcan Spirit Leech is finished, he uses his staff, refreshes his cooldown, Spirit Leeches you again, then the other Hierotitan Spirit Leeches, and then the first one to Spirit Leech now fires a Shems at you. It's like Lord Deletion. You can't get close to that.
Yeah, that's
Um,
hilarious. Oh my god.
yeah. And then Dread Saurians, like people think they're a meme. They're good versus vampire counts. They're good versus Bretonia. If you could take two, then who needs an army, right?
Yeah. And Helman Gorst, of course, did you just put him there as a joke?
Oh yeah, he's incredibly OP. You can't take more than one of him.
They're restricted. You just can't bring Helman Gorst at all. He's just banned in tournament play. So now we've more or less gone through the very basics of unit limits and the restrictions they can have on your armies. And something that's really useful, guys, is we'll scroll down here real quick. Just take a quick glance. You can see here each faction has its own limitations on units, and this is probably the most helpful tool I've come across, at least when I'm building my armies. I always check it past this and just make sure it meets all the criteria. But now back, we're going to be getting to something that is very unique to Total War Warhammer, which essentially are the rules of play, the attacking rules, engagement, because in most RTS games, StarCraft 2, Brood War, Warcraft 3, you don't really need rules like this. Obviously, people have base structures, so if they want to draw kite you to the corner, you can find their base, destroy it, and they lose the game. But in our game, it's very different. So do you just want to go to the rules of play and just start going through that stuff? And of course, we can address any questions from there.
Yeah, of course. This can definitely get a little bit chunky if I explain everything, so I'll try to keep things pretty brief.
Yeah, sounds good.
Essentially, players over the course of a battle must be attacking or preparing to attack each other at all times, and this takes obviously many forms. You could be moving towards your opponent, repositioning, regrouping, or actively expending ammunition. Note that spells are not included here. So what this means essentially, to clarify, because this doesn't really explain what repositioning or regrouping is, and for the most part, the banner rules try to take the approach that, if it's kind of like I'll know it when I see it sort of thing, because oftentimes people try to game the rules in a variety of. When you have very like hard limits on certain things, you get very awkward and unusual rule breaks. Like, if there were like a timer rule, like players may do whatever they like for 5 minutes, and then they must be like seeking engagements with each other. Well, what happens if they nosy around for like 5 minutes and 1 second? Oh well, I guess that's a rule break, right?
Yeah, it's tricky to enforce.
Yeah, so I kind of want to avoid those sorts of awkward situations, which is why a lot of the rules that we're going to go over are a little bit more fluid in that sense and a little bit less specific. But of course, we're here to explain, the ins and outs. So repositioning, regrouping, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of fluid, but I'll say for sure if you're taking like a solid minute to reposition or regroup, you are probably not expressing the intent to attack your opponent. So that would be considered a rule break. And so moving on to that, the way that attacking is defined, you would be expending ammunition at a reasonable pace per the moderator's discretion. This means that if you are firing one shot, running away for 30 seconds, and then firing another shot, and doing that to really drag out the game, that will probably get you called out. So, if you don't want to run into that kind of awkward realm where, you may run into issues of a rule break, then just use your best judgment in what you think a reasonable pace is, strategic and deliberate use of ammunition, rather than to prolong games. Aside from that, we already went over this repositioning. Summoned units are uniquely the only type of spell that does or that is considered attacking. The reasoning for this is because, well, while you could rout or crumble a clan rat or zombie, you cannot rout or crumble a fireball as it's heading towards you. So there's no like real interaction there.
Understood.
And that's it for that. You can chase routing units to be considered attacking. You may engage in combat, and you may also cycle charge your opponent with anything that is not a single entity to fulfill the attacking rule.
So like
Just keep in mind.
cavalry, silver helms, demogryph knights,
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
Yep. Just keep in mind the whole repositioning thing, because you have to reposition it to, get that other cycle charge in. So if you're repositioning for again like 30, 40 seconds, then That's a little bit suspect, right?
Hmm. Understood.
Yeah, and then on to not attacking. Like mentioned earlier, casting spells and most things that single entities do will not be considered attacking.
Yeah, and that's certainly so. Like casting a spell. So, for example, if let's say you're playing like Dark Elves, you have a Supreme Sorceress of Fire. The rest of your army is hiding in the bushes, but you're trying to just fireball spam and pretend like you're attacking. That will not count as attacking. You would need to have like some skirmish cav shooting or an artillery piece. Now, there was something I noticed up above. Single entity artillery. Is this different than, for example, a multi-unit artillery? So, let's say, for example, you have a Queen Bess versus like Empire Great Cannons. Is there a differentiation between those and them counting as attacking?
There is not. So
Okay.
single entity artillery does count as attacking. So you
Mhm.
could hypothetically kite people with Cygors and with steam tanks.
Hell yeah, dude.
Um, just keep in mind that the part of single entity artillery that counts as attacking is their primary missile attack. So if you're running a steam tank away from someone and the steam gun in the back is shooting them constantly, that does not count as attacking.
That brings me back to nightmares of Warhammer 1, dude. I can't tell you how many times that used to happen. Goodness. Cool. So
Yeah.
we've kind of addressed the attacking rules, what counts as attacking, what doesn't count as attacking. You certainly gave a very solid description there. So now another variable, since we don't have a base structure or something that you can really take out to eliminate your opponent, are map features. Of course, you guys have seen this, the dreaded corner camping in quick battles where somebody sits against the corner of the map, denying you angles to attack their army. There's many other ways. Obviously, forest camping is a big problem. So let's go on to map features. What are the basics of positioning? Where are you allowed to deploy on the map? What are some areas that are a little bit touchy? And how does that all work in terms of banner rules and tournament play?
Yeah, so as far as deployment is concerned, the entire deployment zone is always fresh fish, and
Hmm.
you could hypothetically also deploy in the corner. The operative word here is about using the white line of the map defensively. You may use it to corral your opponent. For example, if your opponent vanguards a force behind you, and you decide that you are in your deployment going to leave a few units off to the side, or maybe your entire army in one corner of the map to try to catch these vanguards. If your opponent happens to be there, yeah, go for it. You are using it aggressively to attack something that is near the white line. Um, the foil to this is that due to the necessity to adhere to the attacking rule, is that sometimes in the late game, you might end up in a situation where single entity monsters, usually causing terror, are going to be off to the sides of the map while chasing your units off. And typically, you do not want to fight a monster close to the edge of the map because you will terrify off of the map. Um, so what the line above that is, the very first one here, if you feel and if your opponent is too close to the white line, then you are not obligated to attack them, but you must retreat far enough away and allow them to attack you without being restricted by the white line. Um, so that's kind of the foil to that, to give you the option not to fight monsters at the very edges of the map.
Mhm.
Um, there were a couple of situations before where like crabs or something would sort of kite units kind of close-ish to the white line, and when you hit that point in the game, you're kind of as per the attacking rules, kind of forced to fight them there because that's kind of the natural progression of the battle. So it just gives players a little bit more interaction there. Um, One kind of contentious rule is that impassable terrain, which connects to the border of the map, will also be considered the border of the map, aka the white line. The reason for this is because for any unit that is not a flying unit, this impassable terrain is functionally just an extension of the white line.
Yeah.
So, it does reduce some of the maps that are good for tournament play, but if we're going to limit white line camping or use of the border of the map, then, to me at least, it seems natural that impassable terrain would also get lumped up there.
Of course. And yeah, we typically do our best in, to have maps that do not have, those type of terrain features to even worry about in the first place. Granted, our map pool in multiplayer is somewhat limited. There may seem to be a lot of maps, but, a majority of them, especially the dark elf maps, are just god awful. So that's why it might
Yeah.
seem a little bit repetitive sometimes in terms of our map selection. So It's tricky. Now, forest camping is another one. This one is relatively new-ish, right? Because I remember in Everchosen, it was actually the grand finals where we had, I think it was Felcon against Soothsayer. I can't quite
Hmm.
remember, but there was times, at least in the early days, where people would camp their entire armies in the forest, and to obey the attacking rules, they would simply send a pistolier or something fast out to go shoot, and that would basically be it. And then their opponent had to attack their army in the forest, and it was a very miserable experience. So, what is the current rules for forest camping? Does it constitute a certain portion of their armies allowed to be chilling in the forest? Can none of it be camping in the forest? How exactly does that work?
Yeah, so this is a very nuanced rule right now. It's gone through a couple of different iterations.
Hmm.
Forest camping right now is not something that's necessarily explicitly banned, even though it does say you may not camp a forest here.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, forest camping and the attacking rule have a very strong interaction with each other. Basically, what it means is that, you may not send out a token skirmishing force to drag your opponent to a forest. Um, you may, however, still use forests as cover. And if your opponent is approaching the forest and you are occupying it, you would be obligated to, mount out and attack them. This does still permit you to use the forest as an ambush point. So if you had like three wild riders tucked into a forest vanguarded somewhere, that is obviously perfectly fine. And if you are advancing through a forest and the engagement just sort of naturally occurs in the forest, then that's up to your opponent. The onus is on them because the following line here explicates that they are not obligated to attack an army that's within a forest. So what this essentially means is, like, let's say I'm playing Wood Elves. I take like three Hawk Riders. That's a unit that you can't really interact with,
Mm-hmm.
and I've sat like Durthu, Ariel, and then a bunch of Eternal Guard in a box in the forest. If you, Turin, who were advancing towards me, you could park yourself outside the forest and you would not be obligated to attack me. And if the only thing that I'm doing is skirmishing with Hawk Riders, um, then at that point, I would actually not be adhering to the attacking rule. And so that would be potentially grounds for disqualification or some other penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's kind of the interaction there. Basically, the reasoning for this, in a nutshell, is that forests are uniquely overpowered as far as terrain is considered.
Yeah.
I can go into a very long list of why that's the case, but if anyone is interested in seeing the full reasoning why, then of course, you're free to message me directly, and I'll be happy to provide that.
Yeah, forests can
Um,
be really oppressive because they penalize units of certain size, right? So if you're trying to charge cavalry into trees or monstrous infantry or monsters themselves, it pretty much just shreks your entire army and certainly takes away quite a bit, right, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, forests favor defensive armies, and
Yeah.
the primary defensive unit type is actually infantry, which, funny enough, is the only unit type that is not debuffed in a forest.
Yeah.
So there's that in a couple of recent interactions from CA, which involve being able to shoot out of forests but not into them, and I'm not going to open Pandora's box here.
No worries, no worries. So now we can go on to a little bit about single entities. That's the next category. So there's many
Mhm.
situations where we get into the late games. I'm sure many of you folks watching have been in the situation where all you have left is a single monster. So let's say you have a big, we're using the Vargulf as a perpetual example. So let's say you have a Vargulf, your opponent has a Lord and some infantry. Am I allowed to pull that Vargulf back and run away? Am I allowed to go chase different targets? Am I allowed to cycle charge those infantry with my big monster? Break it down. How do the single entity rules work, essentially?
Yeah, so regarding that, you can actually enter other units, but the way that this works out is that if you have just a single entity with no multi-model unit engaged, that means either in combat or shooting,
Mm-hmm.
um, then it must remain in combat with its new target until it routes or disengages from you. What this means in practice is, if I did take my Vargulf and I decided that, I noticed that you had some swordsmen that were like rallying off to the side. So I pull my Vargulf away from the blob and I go after the swordsmen. Um, let's say they're like half health, and so I would actually need to like cycle charge them quite a few or quite a bit to get them to break without taking much damage in return. That is not something that I can do. So what I would be doing is I would be dragging my Vargulf over to your swordsman, and they will be embroiled in combat from that point on, after I've disengaged from the blob.
Could you
Um,
then bounce over and let's say their lord runs nearby? Could you then grab that Vargulf, disengage those swordsmen, and go after the lord?
uh, no. So unless he were close enough to like make melee contact,
Hmm.
no.
Got it.
So you can like turn around to charge him back, right? You don't have to just eat the charge, but you couldn't like bounce around just to get back to the Lord because that is functionally cycle charging.
Got it.
Um,
Copy that.
and of course, the other caveat to that is that if my Vargulf were fighting your swordsman and you decided to pull your swordsman out of the fight, then I may choose a new target if I so desire from that point.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the trickier rules to enforce because for anyone, I'm sure a lot of you guys have come from a campaign background. We all know how much you can abuse like a 20 stack of Dragon Ogre Shaggoths and take like almost no damage against armies with cycle charging and kiting and just picking your engagements. The same thing can apply to multiplayer to an extent and really unbalance the game. So really that is kind of the purpose of this. And the rules have gotten a little bit more relaxed lately as it pertains to this subject, right? Because previously, if you had a single entity, you weren't allowed to disengage at all, like to go chase different targets, right? You had to stay completely put, but now you can disengage after another target, but you just can't cycle charge the target that you're sitting on, correct?
That is correct. So
Yeah.
basically, the reasoning behind the recent change is that
I like it
for the
personally.
longest, yeah, for the longest time, like you couldn't really interact with single entities that much, but with some of the mass and bracing adjustments in the last patch, infantry stands a much better chance of actually like fighting back. So,
Yeah.
they're not completely helpless, and thus there's not as much of a need to be so strict with them, right? So.
Yeah, for sure. And also something else is so let's say you are you all you have left is your Vargulf, right? And there's some swordsmen. You break those swordsmen, and they're running to the edge of the map. You can count as attacking by chasing those broken swordsmen, right? But if they then shatter, that doesn't count as attacking, right?
That is correct. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Got it. That's something I just wanted to clarify. So next
Mhm.
we have the a little bit of a section about the late game here. So do you just want to walk us through that and what exactly all this stuff means here?
Yeah, so this is a pretty brief section. Usually doesn't come into play, but this is for those more infantry-centric armies to give like dwarf players a little bit more impetus in the late game, instead of having to chase units all over the field with zombie speed. Um, if you're in a position where either one or both of your armies is past about half its starting strength, instead of chasing your opponent's units, if you are being shot at, you can opt to hold your position. So if you felt that you were on somewhat more advantageous ground, then you may plant yourself. The caveat to this is that this advantageous ground must be in open field. So it's fine if that's a hill in open field, but it just must be an open field. Um, and that is essentially all that is there. There is one circumstance where kind of an interaction with the forest camping rule, like let's say, for example, two of your thunderers routed earlier in the battle, the rest of your army gets cleaned up, but your thunderers are now in a forest when they rally, and you still need to shoot your opponent's army. Well, if you weren't allowed to camp the forest, you would have to actually like run them out of the forest and into melee with their units, which doesn't really make any sense. So in that circumstance, do the logical thing, sit there and shoot. It's fine.
Treat yourself, man. And that's it. So next we have army-wide restrictions. So these are things that are not unique to a particular army, but these are just general restrictions to your armies. So do you want to take us through the basic army-wide restrictions?
Yeah, so this basically goes over the remainder of what we have to talk about. So units that have a primary missile attack are limited to 12 in total, and your lords and heroes, to be explicit, are included in this limit. So if you took, let's say, Sisters of Twilight, they do count as one of the 12. Luther
Hmm.
Harkon is also one of the 12.
So,
Um,
so you could have, let's say, Marcus Wolfhart, a witch hunter. That would count as two. And then you could have 5 Empire archers and 5 huntsmen, for example.
yes,
And that would be
and
your
that would,
maximum.
yep, that would be your 12.
Got it.
Obviously, not included here are Night Goblin fanatics. I feel like this is more of a logical thing, but just to make sure, since some people were asking me to be a bit more explicit, just Night Goblin fanatics are not a missile unit. Um, yeah, so since we normally don't have army caps on when we are conducting our tournaments, just to clarify, you cannot take duplicates of named characters or units. Those are all of the regiments of renown, and also special heroes like Felix and Gotrek. As funny as it would be to see two Gotreks running around, uh, yeah, don't do it, guys.
Don't do it. And next
Um,
we have campaign units. This one obviously might seem obvious as well, but you can't bring, the Tour of Rest unique campaign units and all that other sort of good stuff. That'd be pretty absurd for sure. Some factions don't even have that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah, it gets into a whole like awkward realm because some of them are actually balanced well enough for multiplayer use, some of them aren't, and when you start cherry picking like which units are good enough and which units are bad enough, basically, um, it opens a whole can of worms in terms of discussions. And like, while I would like to believe that a lot of people are willing to kind of defer to my judgment, generally speaking, and while I would like to think that my judgment is sound for the most part. You never want to be in that situation where there's too much subjectivity involved in like what isn't allowed. So that's why we decided, it would be simpler if campaign restricted units are just, blanket banned across the board.
Yeah, I think it's a good call. There's some pretty busted ones. And yeah, it's when you start, picking and choosing which ones you think are good, which ones are bad, it just becomes a whole mess for sure. And the last one is an army may have more than one net, but they can't be between your lords and heroes. So, for example, you could bring Marcus Wolfhart and the Templehof Luminarch because that is not between lords and heroes. But if there was an army, for example, that had Marcus Wolfhart plus a light wizard, that would not be permitted because it's between lords and heroes, correct?
That is correct.
Hmm.
So as of right now, the possible combinations are Deathmaster's Sigil and two Warp Grinders, or you may take Howling Warp Gale and two Warp Grinders. That's on the Skaven side. On the Empire side, you may take Marcus Wolfhart and the Templehof Luminarch, or you may take a Light Wizard and the Templehof Luminarch.
Yeah.
So it's just to give players a little bit more you know, impetus, a little bit more agency over their decision making in terms of army compositions. If you really want to go for that like net and snipe type of build, then all the power to you. We just don't want to like go too hard onto it. There comes a certain point where when in a strategy game, when you have too many control tools and too many nets and things like that, that it becomes less interactive as a game, and that's something that we do want to avoid. So it's finding that kind of happy medium. And I think that one net between lords and heroes, and then kind of different depending on units, works pretty well, at least for the time being.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable. Like warp grinders aren't point and click per se. Like they have to be in close proximity. And yeah, the Temple of Luminarch pretty much misses like 90% of its shots anyway. So it's,
Yeah.
it's all in the family there. I think that's totally fine. And that it really is a good point you raised. Like strategy games, even in MMOs, like back in World of Warcraft Vanilla in 2006 and 7, I think it was like 2005 and 6, I can't remember the exact dates, but there was no diminishing returns on like snares and slows, so certain characters just could do nothing. They just got chain kited and snared. But eventually Blizzard added in diminishing returns and all that sort of good stuff, and then it became a much more balanced experience. But and the other stuff we kind of talked about, lords and heroes are limited to three total for armies. Mounts for lords and heroes count towards the limit of the unit they mount. And also the last part says you may not take more than 2 single entity monsters costing 1,800 or more. So do you want to kind of dive into that a little bit? That obviously
Yes.
is like the Star Dragons versus the Phoenixes, correct?
Yes, so this is to kind of help put some parity between monster power levels and to prevent people from just spamming the most expensive monsters available to them. Um, that is a problem in the past, and kind of when you allow people to take a lot of single entities, you have to be very careful about like which ones have more or less strict limitations. So if we actually move on to the next page, this monstrous lord and hero base price index lists all of the lords and heroes with mounts that are considered single entity monsters.
Mm-hmm.
I've nicely listed all of their base prices for you. So you can just take a look at that as a resource and check to make sure that you know your lord of choice and their mount either does or does not break that 1800 mark.
Got it. Yeah, I'm seeing those are pretty nice here for sure. And who designed all the graphics for this as well?
So the graphics for this were primarily done by ODM Zyphos.
It's really nice.
So huge thanks to him for all of that.
Hell yeah, dude. Yeah, it looks really good. And I think my favorite section in this entire guide here, and we're not going to go through every single army, but if you scroll down to the next section, and also for anyone, this might seem a little bit overwhelming at first, but honestly, once you get into the game and just start playing, it really just all clicks super quick. But this section, I think, is probably the most efficient cheat sheet. So you're playing, let's say, for example, you're playing Beastmen. You can see here, there's a section for the Beastmen. Below that, there's a section for the Bretonnians. You can see units that have the red box around them, or the red kind of checkered lines, essentially count as the same unit. So they count towards that same limit of 5 up above, maximum of 4, maximum of 3. If they have the exclamation points, they count as a special single entity, not as your hero-based single entity. So you kind of get the picture of that. Yeah, they have one for all the factions, yeah?
Yep, there's one for every faction. So this basically takes all of the information that I spat at you guys, consisting of like, four or 5 pages of text, and puts it all together in one very comprehensive single page.
Yeah, it's certainly very nice, man. This is some beautiful stuff. It's going to be pretty get pretty hog wild once we get the new 6 or 7 factions from Warhammer 3 for sure. It's going to be a big document.
Yeah. And it will be. It'll look pretty imposing, but I'm confident that we'll find a way to make everything work out.
Now, the last thing probably to touch upon before we close out for today, for the upcoming big tournament for the World Championship, we are going to be using banner rules pick and ban, correct?
Yes, we will. So what this means is that in the very first game, the player on the top side of the bracket will be picking their faction first and banning 2 factions.
Mm-hmm.
These are banned only for this one match, and you may not repeat your bans until the third or until the tiebreaker. Following this first match, your opponent will then pick their faction and ban 2. They may not pick a faction that they've already played, so just keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it gets to a tiebreaker game, then whoever it was that won the previous match will be selecting 3 factions that they have not yet played, and they will be placing 1 ban on a faction that they have not yet banned. Your opponent will ban any of your 3 factions, and this is the only time that they are allowed to ban something that they have previously banned. And they will pick a faction, so you'll be left to pick from the remaining 2 of the 3 that you selected. It's a little bit complicated explained, but I definitely think that it'll click once you get to see it in action a little bit.
And yeah, and if any of you guys have seen ECLs or the different formats on my channel, it's the pick and ban system we use for pretty much everything. You pick, you ban 2, your opponent picks, you switch, you pick 1, your opponent bans 2, et cetera, et cetera. And Aerocrastic, of course, just described the third game, the tiebreaker, the rubber match kind of circumstances. And of course, for anyone who's interested as well, if you're in my multiplayer Discord, there's a tournament rules section. You can see a document there. And of course, it's up on the screen right now as well. And you can see the document, which kind of details all that. So you can always refer to that over the course of the tournament. So now, just in case, somebody gets to the grand finals. So let's say, someone's the champ. They're going for the grand finals. That is most likely going to be a best of 5. Does anything vary between best of 5s and best of 3s in terms of picks and bans? What is the current banner rules rendition for that?
Yes, so as far as best of 5s are concerned, we're still looking for the most ideal format for that.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially the way it works is that the very first 2 games that are played, each player will have the opportunity to ban 2 factions. And then once those 2 matches are concluded, from that point on, players will have only 1 ban.
Got it.
So factions that have particularly extreme ranges of matchups, like dwarves, for example, can be very strong in a best of 5 setting as like the 3rd or 4th faction played in a series, because as your opponent starts, playing some of those counters and you start getting some of their bans out of the way, dwarves become a very scary potential counter pick and also a very scary potential pick yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I think that's good. And once they played the first two games, there's going to be a couple factions eliminated from the pool, which may open up other factions later on. For example, especially if they first pick something like Skaven,
Mhm.
your dwarves are going to be quite a bit safer with the picks and bans later.
Yeah.
So that is more or less it. Obviously, for those of you guys playing in the Grand Tournament, the World Cup or the World Championship, excuse me, there's going to be referees. There's a multitude of folks and support staff who are going to be helping out. So if you guys have any questions about the rules during your games, just shoot them a message in the Discord, of course, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to assist. So on that note, Aero, do you have any closing words that you'd like to say regarding the rules or regarding the tournament? Just any last thoughts?
Well, hopefully this was informative for everyone, and all of you who are playing in the World Cup or interested in seeing how it all pans out. This is definitely going to be an exciting couple of months, so I wish everyone well, and may the best man or woman win.
Sounds good. Well, there he is, Aerocrastic, the two-time ever-chosen champ. Thank you again for joining. And guys, looking forward to seeing you in the World Championship. The prize of $3,500, the biggest prize we've ever had in our community, is certainly up for grabs. And I'll see you guys in the battlefield as I'm playing as well. And I'm sure I'll be crushed in the first round. Thanks again for joining, guys. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Take care, guys.